Welcome to Pirate Politics, where we prepare you for your next political conversation. I'm Jeronimo Cortina, a political science professor at the University of Houston.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus, a political science professor, also here at the University of Houston. Thanks for joining us. An exciting week, obviously. This is a week where we've got elections all across the country.
Finally.
You and I were up late watching returns.
Yep.
Lots of fun, as always.
Indeed.
We'll get into that for sure, especially talking about Houston elections and Texas elections, because that's kind of what we do. But I also want to talk about first some of the national implications to the elections that we saw. In particular, I wanted to talk about Ohio and Kentucky. Democrats had a pretty good night. Maybe, Jeronimo, Democrats who are fretting about Joe Biden's efforts and or lack thereof can take kind of a night off and say, shwoof, it's going to be okay.
Yep, absolutely.
But of course, there's no great prediction here, right? Ohio's been a swing state for a long time, and Democrats winning in Kentucky is like almost flukish, right? The winner of the Kentucky gubernatorial election never predicts who's going to win the White House, but it's certainly the case that they had a good night. And maybe so, yeah. And certainly it's the case that Governor Beshear is going to be a national figure because of this. And that's something they have to think about because obviously they have to figure out who's next after Joe Biden and Kamala Harris. But give me your sense of sort of what you think happened that night, especially in terms of the big issue, abortion. That's the one thing the Democrats want to use as a wedge. And it seems like it worked.
Well, abortion won. Mm-hmm. And especially when you look at Ohio, I mean, the returns are not very, very, very high or anything like that. Mm. But it signals, right, that abortion is a hot button issue once again. And Republicans have lost, that, I guess, touch that they had on the issue, right? Okay. Meaning that once the Supreme Court overruled Roe v. Wade, then, right, they lost every single power. And they have been struggling. Yeah. They have been struggling in terms of trying to find how to pitch that issue, right? And that means, having these, I guess, bans on abortion, especially in many, many, many states. And the election in Virginia, right, was something that they tried to see if this was a test in terms of how to present the issue. It was not a ban, it was a limitation. Right. Instead of having, for example, 6 weeks or something like that, it was going to be 15. So
let me check my notes. Oh, that didn't work. Yeah.
No, it did not work, right? It did not work because Democrats, flipped the House and then they maintained control of the Senate. Yeah. Narrow majority, but still. Yeah.
Still, it's good enough. And like you said, I mean, the governor of Virginia decided that, he was going to basically put that on the ballot. That might have been a mistake. Not literally on the ballot, but figuratively. Right. His idea was like you say, we're going to basically, after this election, the next session, we're going to try to pass a 15-week ban. That didn't go over too well.
Yeah, no.
And so obviously that is something that still sells. And actually, too, you're seeing national groups taking lead from that and from Ohio, who put the constitutional right to an abortion on the ballot. Places like Arizona, Florida, Nevada, Colorado, South Dakota, they're all putting it on the ballot because they know that basically juice up turnout. And so that's a big plus for Democrats coming up. It's a winnable issue for them. And as you said, Republicans are really, I think, struggling to find a way to make this work. So that's definitely something that we're going to see, I think, more and more of. And obviously the politics of this could translate to Texas, but we will see because it's a little different here, right? Yep. For lots of reasons, not the least of which is that females in Texas are less willing to sort of support abortion rights. And so that's slightly different, but it's interesting to sort of mine some of those differences. Let's shift gears and talk legal strategy here. We know Donald Trump has been in some legal hot water for a while. Yep. He has various indictments. He spends more time with his lawyers than he does with his family. This week, the main event takes place in Manhattan, where the former president is taking the stand in a case that's brought against him and his companies by the New York Attorney General Tish James. Basically, this is a big moment. It's a fraud case. The allegations are that the Trumps have committed fraud by understating their net worth and overstating the value of their properties. This basically is really about punishment, right? Because they've already decided that they've done this. The question is sort of what the punishment will be. Not surprisingly, the former president was pretty cantankerous on the stand, challenging the judge, saying, this is something you're going to rule against us on anyway. The kind of had to be reminded that, he wasn't president in 2021. They asked him, like, what were you doing at this time? And he said, well, I was busy running the country. And they said, well, you weren't president in 2021, at least for most of it. So what do you make of this in terms of like the politics of Donald Trump's ascendancy to the nomination for the Republican Party?
Well, I mean, we have talked about these many times, right? And it seems that all these legal tribulations help the president.
It's only pluses for Donald Trump, right?
I mean, the more nastier, the more complicated are the charges, the more the judges said, like, you have to have a gag order, you cannot, belittle the jury members or go against the judge, etc., the more points that he accumulates. So, I mean, for him, either eventually, well, we know that, it's, as you said, it's an issue of punishment, and the punishment can be $250 million fine, and then ban the Trump organization of conducting any business in New York.
Yes.
So, that would be a huge blow, because that's the Trump brand, right?
Yeah.
It's Trump Tower in the middle of Midtown, so on and so forth. But the issue here, I think, is that, how is this going to play in terms of the other Republican primary contenders, right? The real question is, if this thing happens, how the second runner-up, and nowadays is Nikki Haley. Yeah. Can she basically use this situation to her advantage and really solidify her spot as I am the Trump alternative?
Yeah.
DeSantis, no. Christie, no.
You're kicking them out of the
Vivek,
out of the party.
No,
yeah,
exactly.
They're done.
It's going to be either Trump or I. So I think that gives her, some steam to maintain the momentum that she has had in her campaign.
Yeah. And I think you're totally right about this.
Of course.
In fact, not that you're ever wrong.
Thank you.
As far as I can tell, that's never been the case. But polling agrees with you. Basically, polling this week suggested that half of Republicans say they would not vote for former President Donald Trump if he were convicted of a felony. 52% wouldn't vote for him if he were in prison on Election Day. I guess this is good.
Right.
Having a president in prison would be logistically complicated, although easy to defend him in some ways. So I guess the Secret Service is like, that's great. Let's have him. But this is not great for him, because it does show that there is a kind of catch point where at some point Republicans will say, okay, enough is enough. Like, we can't have a president who's in jail. On the other hand, the same polling suggested that he basically is almost at 50% in a hypothetical matchup against every other opponent in the primary. And so there's still a lot of support for him, as you say, but there is a point at which that might actually go away. But we will see, because he could go to prison and he could also go broke, and both of those things would be bad for the Trump brand, as you say.
Well, just ask Giuliani and all the other friends that have been with huge legal bills that they simply cannot pay.
True enough. Yeah, that's going to be expensive and complicated politically.
Yep.
Speaking of complicated politically, let's turn our attention to Washington this week. The ongoing conflict in the Middle East is certainly something, as a military matter and a strategic national security matter, that's been on people's minds. But it's also the case that this has become a kind of wedge issue in the Democratic Party. Yep. We'll talk about this more as things unfold. But this week there was a censure of a very outspoken member from Michigan, Representative Rashida Tlaib. She basically made comments that made it sound like she was defending the Palestinian struggle against Israel. To some people, it sounded like a call for Israel's elimination. She used certain language that has been used that way in the past. And so she basically got the rebuke of her own party, saying, you've gone too far on this. Marjorie Taylor Greene, representative from Georgia, was very outspoken on all kinds of things, wanted to do something more severe, but they ended up pulling that back. How do you read this in terms of like where the Democrats are on this issue, but also where Congress is in terms of trying to police its own members on this and how they might speak their minds, but also how they might misrepresent, kind of the position of the government on this?
So I think there's two issues here. The first one has to do with, member of Congress First Amendment right, right? Yeah. Is this a First Amendment right violation or not, right? That's perhaps something that...
Well, there are lots of caveats to the First Amendment.
Right.
I mean, there are very few on the House floor, but I think you're right. Making sure that people are engaging in a debate on this is important. But, this is certainly something Democrats are divided on, right?
Right.
And Joe Biden certainly has chosen his side. He was very clear about
Right,
this.
right.
So what do you think about that? Do you think politically this is a problem for the Democrats and that they're not showing kind of unity of force?
The problem is the issue itself, right? And the issue is so complicated and so polarized that if you say something that can be, that some side is not going to like or the other, et cetera, it becomes a problem, right? Public opinion, certainly here in the U.S., wholeheartedly supports Israel one way or the other. But obviously, we have seen these within the Democratic Party. And this is, once again, a manifestation of the perhaps more progressive wing of the Democratic Party versus the more traditional wing of the Democratic Party.
Yeah.
So you have these particular tensions, right? And I think that, as you said, the Biden administration has been very clear in terms of its position and very clear saying, well, Israel has a right to defend itself, period, end of question. And then trying to navigate through Secretary of State Blinken, ceasefires, humanitarian aid, so on and so forth.
Yeah.
But it's due to the complexity of the issue, due to the atrocities that were committed, and thus, the Democratic Party did what they did.
It's controversial for sure, and I think it's definitely the case that this is going to be an issue for the president going forward. It's not obvious that people got in lockstep on this, and so that's something he's going to have to navigate through. And clearly Congress is having some trouble passing this, and this is mostly a kind of Republican organizational question in terms of getting together to,
Wonder
if you can imagine,
Oh,
right?
no.
They seem to not have their ducks in a row. The ducks are kind of scattered all across the Capitol, which actually is something that you see if
Just
you
got
go
the
in a little
image of
reflecting pool.
Mike Johnson, Speaker of the House, chasing ducks here.
Trying to bump it. Let's go over here.
move.
That would be easier for him to organize
probably.
the ducks on Capitol Hill than to organize Republicans.
Yeah,
but
probably.
they're having trouble getting funding passed for Israel. That's something we'll talk about next week because we are up against a very tight deadline in terms of getting the government, funded for the next year. So little details.
Yeah. Tomato.
It'll all work itself out. We hope, just like elections in Houston, this is party politics. I'm Brandon. This is Jeronimo. We spent all night looking at these returns, waiting. And now we have some results to talk about. Big picture takeaway from the Houston mayor election. Obviously, it's going to go to a runoff. John Whitmire, the senator from Houston, and Sheila Jackson Lee, member of Congress here from the Houston area. So this was as expected, but big takeaways.
So, 43-35 for Whitmire versus Jackson Lee. In terms of turnout, same thing that we have seen before. Yeah. Nothing new.
See, my face is like,
okay. Exactly.
But that's where a lot of voters were like,
Exactly.
But why? What's happening?
I don't know.
People don't care about this?
I don't know because, especially this election, right? You have a new mayor. We have a fiscal crisis in the city of Houston starting next year. Yeah. We had 14 propositions that many of them were extremely important. Yeah. We have 2 propositions in the city of Houston. Harris County also had propositions in terms of, the hospital district, so on and so forth. Yeah. Very important stuff that really, really, really affects your daily life, commuting, traffic, your favorite one, trash pickup.
Yes.
Get
this done.
Exactly. So I don't know, right? I mean, it's kind of puzzling why, it could be election fatigue, or it could be that, the campaign was,
kind of ho-hum.
Yeah, and 17 candidates, right? So,
No, I think you're right. And oddly, I think that's part of it. And that's that, of those candidates, there wasn't really a kind of strong Republican alternative. And so you don't see a lot of Republicans voting. And we have to kind of crunch the numbers to see for sure. But I think the problem was that it's because without that, there just wasn't as much kind of energy, right? It's a nonpartisan race technically, although these are most, 2 most known Democrats.
Oh, really?
But I think it's not obvious to everybody.
Right.
Not everybody pays as much attention to politics, I have to tell you, as we
fair
do.
Enough.
And so a lot of people are like, who are these people?
Yeah.
So I think that kind of dynamic was a problem. It didn't really generate a lot of turnout, which is usually pretty low in municipal elections anyway. But if you compare this to 2003 or even 2005, when you had better turnout, even though you had a smaller electorate, then you had a viable kind of Republican alternative. But here you didn't have that. So that's one issue. The other is just that it's been hard to get people's attention on a race where they're talking about kind of generic things. They basically agree on stuff.
Yeah.
And the stuff they agree on is kind of boring, right? I mean, everybody knows the sort of problems the city faces, and so they just have to be kind of fixed. And I guess the question here is like a personality question, like who do you think's better to choose that? So really, to me, the kind of story isn't who voted, but who didn't vote. We had about 10% turnout, which is pretty low in a city like Houston, where, as you said, there's some serious issues ahead.
Yeah.
So we will see. Council districts are interesting. You had 7 incumbents who retained their seats, but you also had 3 incumbents who are going to a runoff. That's interesting. I want to ask you about Council District G. This is Council Member Mary Nan Huffman, who has been on council for 1 term, and she faced against trial lawyer Tony Busby, who is wealthy and has more tanks than you and I together, and can park them anywhere he likes, he thinks. What do you think about this? That's a runoff, which wasn't looking that way for a while, but eventually, he kind of
got there,
up. What do you think about this? Handicap this race for me.
So it's going to be interesting, right? It's going to be interesting to see it because it seems that Tony Busby wants it and wants it bad. Yeah. So,
as evidenced by all the mailers I get at my house, definitely interested in seeing this race.
Right. So, it was 49 versus 41%. Yeah. And it's going to be very interesting. I mean, we're going to see, once again, this is going to be more interesting because, the choice is very clear between the candidates, at least in terms of perhaps, how they approach the political system. Right?
Yeah.
So
that was a very cryptic way of saying that Tony Buzz is going to blow things up, which now he can, right?
Yeah.
Because, as you said, propositions on the ballot were important. Proposition A here in Houston allowed for 3 members of council now instead of the 5 normally to be able to bring up an issue on the agenda. Houston's the only strong mayor system in the state.
Yep.
And so it's something that basically the mayor gets to control the agenda, period. That gives them a lot of power. But now you've got more council who can sort of inject their own thoughts onto this. And with a Tony Busby on council and some new dynamics in terms of the other players, right? They replaced Dave Martin in E, who was a kind of loyal opposition to Turner, and they worked together on a bunch of things. So normally in Houston, it's like go along, get along. But your tone of voice makes me think that you're expecting to see a little bit more fireworks on this. Is that what you?
I mean, I think that if Tony Busby wins the runoff election, is going to be more complicated for whoever gets elected as mayor, right? Because he's not going to hold back one iota in terms of looking to create breaches or something like that. No, as long as he has 2 members of city council, he can put whatever he wants in the agenda.
It's a great point. And honestly, with kind of a likelihood of a meager turnout for a runoff, I think, there's a chance that could work for him. So we'll see hopefully better turnout or reasonable turnout because there's going to be, like I said, several of these runoffs that are happening. Another runoff is in the controller's race. This is Chris Hollins and Orlando Sanchez are going to face off. Sanchez obviously has been in and around Republican circles for a long time. He's run for mayor before. He's former treasurer in the county. And Chris Hollins, who's kind of a Democratic newcomer. This is an interesting race because this is definitely kind of old guard Republican where the county used to be, and a kind of new style Democrat where the county's moving. So what's your take on sort of what that's going to look like in the dynamics of it?
Well, I think it's going to be a very interesting race, right? First of all, I think both candidates have the credentials in terms of, they know what this job entails.
Yeah. And the challenges
that
they'll face.
Yeah. So I think that, in terms of, experience, so on and so forth, perhaps I'll give the edge to Sanchez a little bit because he was a Harris County treasurer before, so he knows the numbers, et cetera, how the county operates and obviously how the city operates. And Hollins also has that, he also understands, finances. Yeah. So it's going to be very interesting because might be an obscure quote unquote position, but it's going to be extremely important next year in terms of, the budget because we are looking literally, standing on the edge of a fiscal cliff, just looking down.
Like your toes are over the edge.
Exactly.
In a very scary way.
Right.
That's why I don't ride roller coasters. Don't have the nerve for it.
There you go.
But Hollins and Sanchez hopefully do because they're going to have to stare down a mayor and council who are facing a serious financial crisis for the city. And so that's the real question for me is like, they know the numbers, right? The X's and O's and dollars and cents. Can be done. And honestly, they don't do a lot of that anyway. They're just kind of managing the office. But they have to stand up to council. They've got to stand up to the mayor because these are going to be some big, really hard items they're going to have to undertake, and they're going to have to convince the public to some degree that these things are acceptable.
Especially because during the campaign, all the candidates were talking about spending, right? The only one was Council Member Gallegos that says like, all right, everybody agrees with this thing. How the hell are we going to pay for this?
What are we going to do? Yeah.
So that is going to be a role. It's like, oh, we're going to hire, 500 new police officers. Yeah. Okay. And how are we going to pay for
and
that?
We're going to get that money.
I don't know.
I don't want to pay it, but we may have to. There may be no choice. But that's the real question they're going to have to face. Proposition B was also pretty interesting. That passed by a less healthy number, but still passed. It's going to basically reorient the city of Houston and the region in terms of this sort of shared partnership of governments over kind of flood control issues. So basically, they're going to have to either re-engineer how many votes Houston gets and Harris County gets, or Harris and Houston are pulling out of this thing. So that would be really telling. Let's talk about statewide propositions. They all passed. So we're going to have no wealth tax, which is good for you since you're exceptionally wealthy. Homestead exemption passed, not surprisingly. People want a tax cut. Good news for them. Energy fund funded. Right. Universities funded. Thank you very much.
Yes,
the
indeed.
one thing, though, that went down was Prop 13. This was a bill. This was a proposition that would increase the mandatory retirement age for judges from 75 to 79. Right. It went down, and this rarely happens. Usually these are passed by a fairly healthy margin, but this one went down. So just as one implication to this, Nathan Hex, who's the Chief Justice of the Texas Supreme Court, is 74 years old. So this would have actually saved him from having to retire, but now he'll have to retire. The likelihood is that he'll basically be replaced by Abbott on that bench, which is a very common occurrence for governors. But I think this is a win for Democrats, right? Because they wanted to have a position where, like, basically more churn on the courts means more open seats and more potential for Democrats to be able to take those seats. And in some cases, like, the courts are really the kind of first tip of the spear. That's how it was for Republicans. Like, they started winning bigger at the state level in these judicial races. So what do you think about this? Surprising or no?
Well, I mean, on the one hand, yes, it is very surprising, right? Because I thought that it was going to pass as the other 13 proposition, but it didn't. Yeah. And I think it shows also perhaps, that those that voted had a very clear idea of what does this mean, right? It's not just, it regardless of the political party, right, is allowing, that recycling of judges so they can present new ideas in terms of how to rule or how, whatever is that they were running on. So I think it's important. I think, it's a good result in terms of allowing that, just to recycle. And it's okay, now is the new time for the newcomers.
Yeah. And do you think that, like, there's the kind of backlash against this kind of older sort of politician in office, right? We've talked a lot about this, like Mitch McConnell, Dianne Feinstein, sadly, rest in peace, Joe Biden, Donald Trump, like, they're all, above 70. And so is there a kind of reaction to that where people look at this and say, like, no more, not in the judiciary?
Well, I think probably there is, right? I mean, when you look at all, you just mentioned them all, right? Yeah. It's
No, there are more.
Well, no, there are more, absolutely. But, the most visible. I mean, I think it's time, just to, retire and seriously spend time with your family.
Just buy a lake house or something. Yeah, like
right.
classic car.
But
and
I
fix
think
it up.
that's true, right? I think that's true, especially when we see the Texas electorate that is changing so much in terms of becoming younger and younger and younger.
Yeah. Speaking of elections, one I wanted to mention that's not in Houston is a mayoral race in Uvalde, Texas, which obviously is the location of the tragedy where 19 children and 2 adults were killed in a school shooting. In addition to the botched response from law enforcement, this drew a lot of controversy. One woman who was the daughter of one of the young women killed, Kimberly Mararubio, lost her election. She basically made this a national issue, in some cases because it was about sort of the availability of guns. She tried to get the Texas legislature to increase the age to purchase an assault rifle from 18 to 21. She wasn't successful there, so she thought, let's go the politics route, the electoral route. She didn't win, but ultimately they literally hugged it out, right? The person who did win, Cody Smith, who's a former mayor, is going to return to office, but they kind of embraced, and I like it because I think it's good for, first of all, us to accept electoral losses. That's important. That's part of this system.
Yep.
The other is that there's a community atmosphere to this. We have to work together on these issues, and we may not always agree, but we have to be aware that these things are meaningful and that the community matters more than just our individual pride about losing an election.
No, absolutely. And when you see, the hog that they posted on Twitter, on X, formerly known as Twitter, it really shows, right, that it was like wishing Mata Rubio was literally in a good, decent way wishing Smith, good luck. So that was very nice. And also her little son was also saying hello, and the husband was there. So I think, that shows,
it's a good moment.
We can still be civil, right?
Yeah.
And we can still be, accepting losses, so on and so forth, and work for the community. So that was very, very, very nice. On contraire, right? Now we're going to have a new special session.
Wow.
Where civility might not be perhaps the
I don't think you're going to see a lot of it. Yeah, you have the, governor just back from Israel. Dan Patrick has viral pneumonia. Mom and dad are fighting, right? Phelan and Patrick are at each other on X. Only 2 bills made to the governor's desk from the last special. Is a fifth time going to be a charm here? I just don't know, because the governor thinks there's a deal to be had. It's not clear. There are about 24, 25 hard no's on vouchers, and they didn't even get any kind of traction in terms of immigration bills. So, what's going to happen?
Everything is up in the air once again, and we don't know what's going to happen.
Yeah.
It's very, very, very tense situation, and the governor has put a lot of stuff into it. Yeah. But this is going to be one of the issues that we're going to talk about next week. I'm Jeronimo Cortina.
And I'm Brandon Rottinghaus. The conversation keeps up next week.